Once again, Vladimir Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons in the course of his war against Ukraine. In his TV address to the nation just recently, announcing a level of mobilization, he even said, "This is not a bluff." Now, it's not the first time that Putin has made nuclear threats during the course of this crisis. So what does this threat mean? How dangerous is this moment? Well, to find out, I spoke to one of the world's leading experts on nuclear conflict, James Acton of the Carnegie Endowment think tank based in Washington, D.C. I started by asking him to spell out just what it is that Vladimir Putin has threatened now.
Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons in a set of circumstances, including threats to the territorial integrity of Russia, the livelihood and well-being of the Russian people. But for me, this was it was a clear nuclear threat. And as such, it was dangerous and reckless, and one that I take seriously. But it was also, I think, a vague nuclear threat. And not everybody agrees with this analysis. But, my view is we can't read into this precise and specific circumstances in which Putin would use nuclear weapons. I very much doubt that he has defined those precisely in his own mind. The way that I interpret this threat is if things go badly in unspecified ways, then Putin is reserving the right to use nuclear weapons.
So how would you draw a distinction between what he said in this address and what he said at the beginning of the war? So just announcing the war, he made nuclear threats. Also, just a few days after the beginning of the war, he also declared that he was putting nuclear forces on a certain level of alert, which was rather unclear. How would you draw a distinction between what he said now and what he said back then 6 months ago?
There's a couple of distinctions you could draw. I mean, one is an important one, which is, back in February when he made that threat, he announced a specific change to Russia's nuclear force posture. Now, that turned out not to be such a big deal. It was to do with the number of personnel at command posts. It could have been a lot worse, but there was a specific change announced to Russia's nuclear posture. That didn't happen on this occasion. Another distinction you could draw is Putin set out this fairly expansive set of circumstances in the most recent threat in which he would use nuclear weapons, which were somewhat different from the circumstances he made in February. But I think he shouldn't try and overinterpret that. To my mind, the difference between what Putin said then and what Putin said now, or what Putin said now and Russia's official nuclear declaratory posture, I worry that those differences are more noise than they are signal. That is to say that a lot of people try to read these threats like lawyers, assuming that any slight differences between what's said now and what's said previously are the result of careful deliberation and a very deliberate signaling on Putin's part, indicating changes in the circumstance in which he may use nuclear weapons. I am skeptical that much thought went into this. I see these much more as kind of reflexive moves by an angry and cornered leader. Now, that doesn't make them any less dangerous. I think this is a dangerous situation, and I take these threats seriously. But my point rather is that analyzing precise differences in wording between then and now, as I say, I think that's signal rather than noise. Sorry, I think that's noise rather than signal.
Well, just to kind of get to that sort of big picture point, what you just said there, that a sense of a leader being cornered, and many people have said this, that this seems, an act of desperation rather than strength by Putin. Now, we spoke after those initial threats at the beginning of the war, and we'll put a link to that in the notes to this video. But during that conversation, I rewatched it. You said that the scenario that concerned you most was a scenario maybe a little bit like what we're seeing now, that Putin feels cornered and his rule begins to look under threat. And I think many have interpreted that with this step now, he's kind of digging further into a hole in terms of this war. So given that context, do you feel it is beginning to look more like this scenario that concerned you most? And are you, say, more worried and concerned than you were 6 months ago?
So the first thing to say is I think nuclear use is not imminent. I would have been much more concerned if Putin had issued an order like removing nuclear warheads for non-strategic delivery systems from storage and preparing to make those warheads with their delivery systems. That's not something we saw. I also think that if nuclear use had been imminent then, or if Putin was seriously considering nuclear use in the short term, we would have seen very specific demands from Putin. So, in a general sense, I don't think nuclear use is imminent. I am somewhat less concerned than I was back in February. I was, when Putin issued his order to increase the alert level of Russian nuclear forces before we understood what that order actually meant, that was a very concerning moment, and I'm not as concerned then, but I am concerned. The way that I view it is there are three circumstances that I think would make nuclear use by Russia more likely. The first would be a catastrophic military defeat. The second would be Putin losing his hold on power. And the third would be the Russian economy on the brink of complete collapse. And I've been saying for a few months now that those conditions could emerge, but they didn't look at all proximate to me. And I think, there are, from Russia's perspective here, there are some worrying trend lines. Ukraine is at a long way from winning this war. But there is the possibility that Ukraine will take back Ukrainian territory that Russia illegally and wrongly, but considers Russian territory, including probably most importantly, Crimea from Russia's perspective. We're seeing some protests in Moscow. At the beginning of the war, we saw protests. They emerged. They were dissipated very rapidly. I'm not expecting right now to see serious threats to Putin's leadership, but I can't absolutely discount that possibility. So, if, as I say, if you have these trend lines that from Russia's perspective look kind of, or from Putin's perspective more specifically, look kind of worrying, and if you extrapolate these outwards in a way that looks particularly worrying for Putin, then I think nuclear use could become more likely.
I want to talk a little bit about what kind of nuclear weapon use it could come to, if it did come to that. Because people talk a lot about the possibilities of potentially a sort of a warning strike, which might take place sort of perhaps, even out over the ocean, something like that. A use of a small nuclear weapon in the battlefield as up against, the biggest thing, a long-range sort of strategic strike. Could you just walk through a little bit about what do you think of conceivable scenarios for each of those, or if there are any others I haven't mentioned, and what do you think the purpose of each of those might be?
The first thing I think we have to say is we should be very modest in predicting what Russian nuclear use would look like. We don't know. And honestly, I doubt the Russian military knows. Like, at the end of the day, it will be up to Putin. He may be presented with options, but he will do whatever he thinks is best. And it's very, very hard to predict what that could look like. I think a plausible situation, plausible pattern for first use might be something like a nuclear detonation over the northern Black Sea, something like that, a warning shot, maybe over a less inhabited area of Ukraine. I wouldn't entirely rule out battlefield use against Ukrainian formations. In all of those cases, though, the purpose would be the same. It would basically be to try to terrify Ukraine, and I think particularly Ukraine's Western backers, into backing down because of the threat of further escalation. The purpose, I think, the primary purpose would not be to degrade Ukrainian forces on the battlefield. Clearly, nuclear use may have that effect, and that may be an added bonus for Putin, but I don't think that would be the primary driver for nuclear use. I think it would be aiming to inflict terror.
Now, if we take one of those scenarios, I mean, for instance, the sort of the lowest level of those scenarios, what you described there, a detonation of a nuclear weapon, maybe a relatively small one in a deserted area over the Black Sea. What would then be if we look at the West that is really trying to, warn Russia off from taking any such action, what are the available options for action there? What would they be thinking of? What is the appropriate response to a nuclear detonation that maybe kills nobody?
Just like I don't think we know what Russian first use would look like, I don't think we know what the Western response would be. One could imagine a whole range of responses. anything from conducting a similar demonstration shot through to a demonstration nuclear shot, kinetic but non-nuclear strikes, cyber attacks. I mean, there's a whole range of possibilities here. And let me emphasize two things. Firstly, this would be an enormously dangerous situation. I think that part of the Western response would depend on what the international response was. If the entire global community, including China, said to Russia, you have crossed a line and this is completely unacceptable, we are going to treat you like a pariah, economically, politically, culturally. And even Russia's close friends like Iran and China treated them in that way, there would be much less of a need for a military, let alone a nuclear response. If the international community as a whole fails to act in a robust way against this kind of Russian outrage, then there would be more pressure on the United States in particular to take prevailing actions, including nuclear use. Second thing to emphasize is, I should have said before, there are actually steps Russia could take even lower down the nuclear ladder than a demonstration shot. I mean, the very lowest step that Russia could take, which would still be enormously provocative to be sure, would be an underground nuclear test on Russian territory. That I think would actually be a pretty hard thing to respond to, because the US isn't going to want to do an underground nuclear test in response. And being on Russian territory rather than Ukrainian territory would also make it harder for us to respond.
And you talk about the response by the international community, the non-Western international community, as being so important. Just put this in context for us, because there has been a taboo on nuclear use, which goes back all the way to the only time in which nuclear weapons have been used in anger. Can you just put this in context, like how much of a shock to the international system would even the lowest level thing, one of the lowest level actions here be? This breach of that taboo, how important would that be?
Yeah, so in this category, I would put Russian nuclear use on Russian territory in a different category from Russian nuclear use anywhere else. Countries have conducted many nuclear tests on their own and actually other people's territory as well. But, anything like a demonstration shot over the Northern Black Sea really would be kind of absolutely unprecedented. I think in many ways it would be arguably the most shocking event to have happened since the end of the Second World War. Partly because nuclear weapons haven't been used in warfare since the bombing of Nagasaki. And so it would break this long tradition of non-use. But even more so because there would be some risk of absolutely catastrophic escalation, civilization ending escalation. I can't put numbers on that. I don't know how likely it would be. Hopefully cooler heads would prevail long before you reach that point. But once the nuclear threshold has been crossed, there is no guarantee you're going to be able to stop short of the end of civilization. And I think it would be a profoundly shocking experience, and one that I don't think we know what the other side of that event horizon actually looks like.
So this is the threat that we're looking at now. It's the second time in 6 months that Putin is making this kind of threat. We've already seen the West try to respond to this. Essentially, Western powers seem to be treating this as a bluff, even though Putin said in his very comments that it's not a bluff. What do you think what's your advice to Western leaders thinking about how to deal with this threat?
Look, I don't think Western leaders are treating this as a bluff. They're not conceding, they're not caving into Putin. They're going to continue supplying Ukraine with resources and military equipment. But I I've never heard anybody has said Putin, I don't think Western leaders, to my knowledge, have said Putin is bluffing. I think they are deciding that the risks of, the cost-benefit analysis of supplying this assistance to Russia is still positive from a Western perspective. So I think it's important to continue to show a unified face. I think it's important not to, I think everything the West has done for Ukraine so far has been reasonable and proportionate, and it's not anything that I oppose. And I think, we should stay the course. At the same time, there's some calls to escalate largely for the sake of escalating, out of this belief that if we just put enough pressure on Russia by escalating further, that Russia will eventually climb down. I think that is a mistake to escalate for the sake of escalating. There may be arguments in time for supplying longer range weapons to Ukraine, I think we have to judge those on a case-by-case basis. But as Biden in particular has been, we should be very wary about further escalating. And finally, I do think that if Putin at some point in the future decides he wants a way out, which he does not appear to want at the moment, we should be thinking about what that looks like. And that's going to be a difficult and painful thing to think through. But ultimately, if our ultimate goal is to defend the territorial integrity and existence of Ukraine as a state, I think the best way of doing that will ultimately be to reach some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, look, Putin doesn't want to talk right now. His demands are completely unreasonable to the extent he's actually making any demands at all. There's no prospect of negotiations in the immediate future. But, I think we should be, and maybe this war ends without negotiations, but I think we ought to prepare for that as a possibility at some point down the line.
And because last time we did talk about off-ramps 6 months ago, the importance of providing an off-ramp. The way it looks, instead of seeking an off-ramp, Putin is sort of doubling down further. As you look at the sort of trajectory of this, does it look to you like a leader who is sort of thinking, all right, I go down. If this fails, I go down?
Not exactly. I don't think Putin imagines going down. I think his plan is to stay in office and to stay alive, and he will do whatever is required to do that, which is actually an inhibiting factor on nuclear use. It doesn't preclude the possibility, but I think his desire to stay alive probably does inhibit nuclear use. I've always thought it's important to try to provide him with off-ramps. But he has to want to take those, which he doesn't at the moment. He's clearly doubling down right now. So when I talk about preparing and thinking about what off-ramps could look like, none of that is done with any expectation that Putin is going to show any interest in negotiating in the short term.
Finally, I'd just like to, we talked interestingly last time about historical comparisons. Are there any kind of moments in history that you look to see, any lessons for what we're dealing with at the moment?
You've always got to be careful here, because every crisis is different, and those differences can sometimes be very important. But going back to this conversation about off-ramps, if you look at the most dangerous moment of the nuclear age, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was prepared and indeed did give Khrushchev off-ramps in that situation. That involved a secret promise to withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey about 6 months after the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba. And that is the kind of creative thinking that I think is, governments ought to be doing behind the scenes. Giving Putin any kind of concessions is deeply unpleasant and distasteful. But just as it was better to give Khrushchev concessions in '62 rather than increase further the risk of a nuclear war, I think we should be thinking about what off-ramps in this current situation look like. Not least because the Ukrainian people are going to be suffering enormously the longer this war continues for. And again, like, I'm not naive about any of this. We should be very clear. Putin is not seeking an off-ramp at the moment. I'm not confident. I'm not confident, like, there's not going to be serious negotiations, I think, in the short term. But that doesn't, I think, obviate the value of starting to think through some way of helping Putin extricate himself from this disaster if he wants it.
All right, James Axton, thank you very much for talking to us today. And we'll look forward to checking back in with you further down the line. Thank you very much.